Howdy, all you delicious people. Have you minded your surroundings lately? Going into this movie, really looking back on it, because ultimately I had probably seen this movie, probably in all actuality, I had seen this movie on TV, but I never really paid quite close attention to it from its original release. So, or from my original release of being able to see it, me being happy about it. Going into here, I think I have to mention some things, cryptically, of course, but anyways, this is probably going to be hands down the best origin story of a superhero that tells like the complete origin story, the entire driving force for the character, everything. You have it to where you have this character that is to be mentally scarred by something at a young age, and you have it to where uh, this scarring just had to take years to just manifest, to where eventually we have it to where Bruce Wayne takes this manifestation of sorts and is driven to by anger to become something, to otherwise realize that he needs to become a symbol. Also, and a lot of people could argue about, like, well, no, I think the best origin story has to be Iron Man, or the best origin, like, I think Iron Man and Batman Begins could be maybe quite possibly an equal origin story when it all comes down to it, because, like, that story is a really great movie, and Christian Bale's Batman Begins is a great movie as well. Like, I just think that when looking at it, like, I think that this story is just a little bit more difficult than Iron Man, because when looking at it, it's like you have several different layers of Batman that you have to go through. You have to go through the younger years of a younger Bruce Wayne, and then like the college Bruce Wayne, and then the current time Bruce Wayne. Like, it's kind of an evolution of a character, so we have to like really invest in a character that uh, has been kind of gone through different phases of life. Like, we don't get that with any other character. We don't get that very often with any other superhero. When looking at it, I think that this is the best approach of a young Bruce Wayne, even comparing it to either Batman Forever, which is, like, to me, like, the young Bruce Wayne parts in that movie is just like a fever dream that doesn't make any rational sense. Gotham, ultimately, to me, I didn't really care for the show Gotham. Ultimately, when looking at it, I think a lot of people would just tell you it's like, well, hey, like, those early seasons are just like the kind of the building blocks to get us to bigger and better things. And I'm just like, I really don't care to go in a show where ultimately I have to just like, well, wait till season 5 and then work your way up. Like, to me, that kind of feels like Smallville to me, where it's just like, I didn't care for like the first 5 seasons. Immediately when I would watch Smallville, like, I'm gonna start watching it at season 5 and then work my way to season 10, and which would probably I'd make it to probably season 9, and I'm like, yeah, I think that's about all I need. Because season 10 is a huh. But anyways, because it's a throwaway. That whole season is like, the whole last season is just kind of like a throwaway to me, because they threw it away because they're like, yeah, we're done. So this movie has to, hands down to me, be the best origin story, with the exclusion of Iron Man. But still, this one, like, this has got to be also the best Bruce Wayne Alfred interaction of any of the Batman movies. I don't care what anyone will say. Like, oh no, the Michael Keaton Alfred interactions were. No. When we're really looking at it, like, there was a lot of tender moments between Alfred and Bruce Wayne. Like, you could really tell, and there was also funny moments as well. Uh, like, there were times where ultimately Alfred was treated like family to Bruce, but then there's also some times where it's just like, well, hey, like, I also kind of pay you, so like, go and go and try to be me for a while, like, try to smooth these people over, kind of thing. Here's the thing. We end up a lot of times in this movie ultimately have this one-upsmanship of lines, where ultimately we have it to where a lot of times where there is always a line that comes back around, and it's always just like a way of which to ultimately just say, like, oh well, I just want to one up you by throwing something that someone had said to you before, and so aha. There are so many times where so many lines are honestly recycled here. It's so goofy. Uh, Here's also the thing. It's kind of funny when watching like Batman 1989 and watching this movie. Because when looking at it, Rachel Dawes, who is Katie Holmes in this movie, and looking at Vicky Vale in the Batman 1989, it's like, man, like, the Vicky Vale character was so much more important in that movie than Rachel Dawes is in this movie. Like, really, it just kind of feels like a lot of stuff with Rachel Dawes. Like, they kind of they kind of make it to where she is a part of the story, but she's not a prominent part. We end up having it to where also, like, to be brutally honest, uh, Dr. Jonathan Crane, the Scarecrow, he's not a prominent part of this movie either. Like, yeah, you can say it's like, well, but he's the one that figured out how to do this and this and that. Like, yeah, but still, he's just not really a prominent role in this movie. It's too much about Bruce, and too much about even like Commissioner Gordon, to be brutally honest, and also uh, Bruce and ultimately his journey. Let's just say in a very cryptic way, because ultimately what ends up happening in this movie, I'll kind of go into much more spoilers about that. So there is almost a kind of Shakespearean way of like really watching this movie. Like, a lot of the times while I was watching this movie this time around, I'm like, no person would actually say any number of these lines like this, uh, like in real life. Like, I feel like there were so many times where I was just like, nobody would actually go and say any number of this dialogue in a real life situation. Like, to me, I just found some of the line delivery to be very goofy. Uh, like, just some of the lines, not the line delivery. Some of the lines just goofy. Um, Someone will rattle your cage. Someone who will rattle their cages. You better rattle those cages. We end up having it to where ultimately, if you're not, or he's not the devil, he's practice. Goofy approaches. We end up having it to where, like, there is so much intelligence. There's so many smart things going on in this movie that you can still really enjoy this film. It feels like a timeless film. That's the best part about it. Is that this movie is so good at what it does that you can watch this at any time and still really enjoy it. How we have Lucius Fox in this movie, and of course, it is played by probably the greatest actor of all time, Morgan Freeman. Uh, how we have such an amazing cast in this movie, with it being that, like, every little part in certain circumstances did matter, with the exclusion of Rachel Dawes and Scarecrow. Um, but everybody else, important parts. Everyone else but those two characters, really important. Well, with the exclusion of maybe like a police chief here or a Flass there or whatever. But anyways, so going into here, I just really enjoy the build of this movie. Um, the only thing that I thought was goofy was the device that was in the subway at the end. Like, I was just kind of like, this is the goofiest approach to really ending a movie. And I wish there was a much more, like, fighting out way of this movie. And there isn't. It's just a, hey, device in a subway. Ah! Like, you gotta stop it. And so, really, that is kind of like the goofiest thing about this movie, is just the way it, the way it has to just kind of like go, like, the way it has to try to be different is ultimately the goofy side of it. Um, but anyways, like, it kind of feels like they had to like perfectly intertwine things together, and that's what kind of makes things a little bit goofy in this movie. But anyways, I think it's about that time to go into spoiler time. Because reasonably, yeah, I'm gonna have to go and going in and talking about this a lot and just kind of dissect it. I probably may not get to every moment of this movie, and there's some people that might be saying like, "Oh, well, what about this part and what about that?" Because ultimately, really looking at it, there's some stuff that I'm going to have to probably just like really just slice and dice for time. Um, or there's some stuff that I just like think of just it not being all that important enough. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this movie. You better mind your surroundings. How about this? Anyways, so going into this movie, we have it to where we end up having an origin story that ultimately has it to where, okay, we end up finding out that Thomas Wayne is ultimately a doctor in this movie. It's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. It's like very rare do we actually get it to where we have a building of even like Wayne's parents. Like, the very first thing you normally see in a Batman movie is, okay, I can't wait till they just get shot and die right next or right behind a movie theater. I can't wait for that moment to happen. Where I guess in this movie it's actually a play instead of a movie. Because ultimately I think that's a better idea. So, or it's an opera, play, whatever. So, going into here, we ultimately have it to where Wayne is a doctor, and so ultimately we end up finding out that it seems that Bruce Wayne is terrified of bats. Like, I'm really trying to like do a timeline approach to this review, with the scenes of this movie rather than uh, rather than like doing the movie and like showcase, like, I'm trying to do it in a different way. So we end up having it to find out that Bruce Wayne is terrified of bats, and here is why. So ultimately, we end up having it to where it's seemingly we find out that Bruce Wayne had found a well, and he ended up uh, having a game played with Rachel Dawes called Finders Keepers. It seems that ultimately they were to be playing around with an arrowhead. We eventually find out that Bruce ends up falling into this well where ultimately he had gotten attacked by bats. It seems that Thomas Wayne goes with a pulley system or a rope system to go and get Bruce. We ultimately end up finding out that I believe that his arm is broken. We end up having Thomas Wayne who resets the arm, and ultimately we end up having it to where Thomas Wayne tells Bruce, "Why do we fall, Bruce? So we can pick ourselves back up." So we end up having it to where we find out that that Thomas Wayne had put together the this train, this North Rail, that ultimately everyone rides in Gotham, and so we end up having it to ultimately that they end up showcasing the Wayne Enterprise building, and so we end up having it to where Bruce Wayne ultimately mentions to his father, it's like, well, hey, you work at that building, right? And ultimately Thomas Wayne says, like, well, like, I leave that building to two other men, like uh, more like men that'll actually uh, treat the building a certain way compared to Thomas. It's like, dude, I'm just a doctor. Like I'll just give them my money and they'll do whatever. Like, nah, I'm not gonna. Like, nah, I'll just show up and just like, nah, hey, I made another $1 million today. So, anyways, pushing on. So we end up having it to where Bruce, Bruce and Thomas and Martha all go out to a play. And so we end up having it to where ultimately there's a part of the play where there's ultimately people that are kind of flying around and it looks questionably like bats. Bruce Wayne gets terrified and ultimately leaves because he is just kind of terrified. We eventually have it to where Thomas Wayne and Martha ultimately leave behind him, and ultimately Martha is like, "Well, hey, what's wrong, Bruce?" And Thomas is like, "Oh no, hey, like, if anything, like I got a little winded. It's like opera goes a long way. Isn't that right, Bruce?" So we end up having it to where they end up strolling along, and we end up having it to where Joe Chill, of all people, ends up pulling a gun onto Thomas and Martha Wayne, ultimately asking for the pearls and the wallets and stuff along those lines. We end up having it to where Thomas Wayne is ultimately just like, hey, like relax, buddy. I'll give you my wallet. I'll give you, and we ultimately have it to where ultimately Joe Chill like asks again, like, I wanted the necklace. So we end up having it to where Thomas Wayne gets in the way. Ultimately, that is when Joe Chill just fires it out, just pops both parents. We end up having it to where ultimately Thomas Wayne is to fall over. Bruce Wayne is to try to uh, like comfort his father, and we ultimately have it to where Thomas Wayne tells Bruce, it's like, don't be afraid. So we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce Wayne is to be rescued seemingly by, I would say, Jim Gordon. He ultimately ends up putting a coat over his shoulders, I guess, to comfort him, and ultimately we have it to where ultimately that Alfred is to go and retrieve Bruce Wayne. We eventually have it to where Bruce ultimately had said that he was so scared, and maybe it was his fault that ultimately his parents had died. And ultimately, Alfred comforts him and ultimately says, no, it was his fault and his alone. It was Joe Chill's fault, not yours. So we end up fast tracking to ultimately have Bruce Wayne being going to college, and we end up having it to where uh, Bruce Wayne had said that seemingly uh, he had been fine with staying at college, but college wasn't feeling the same way. College felt that he's done all that he could do, and so like, hey, just go back home. Like, really, for Bruce, it's just basically like, I think he had been trying everything to just escape that, when really going back to that home and really going like back to really just Gotham, like, is getting him to the point of wanting to just like do something. Like, he needed to act. Like, he needed to uh he needed to do something for his parents. He needed to do something to he like, when looking at it, like, the guy is a millionaire, but or a billionaire or whatever, but like, he can't do anything. So it's just the fact of just like, he's like, why is it that I have so much money but I can't do anything? I'm just kind of stuck where I am. But anyway, so we end up having it to a lot of times where ultimately Bruce is to, or Alfred is to talk to Bruce about the Wayne name. And ultimately we have it to where ultimately Bruce kind of like mentions that like the Wayne name had died with his father. And like, there's a kind of debate about that between Alfred and Bruce. Ultimately mentioning that like Alfred will never give up on Bruce. It's like, why do we fall, Bruce? We can pick ourselves back up, kind of thing. So we ultimately have it to where ultimately Alfred is saying to Bruce that he should never besmirch the Wayne name, because that's all that's left is the name. Uh, really, like, I would say Alfred is kind of more along the lines of like saying that like, well, Thomas is gone, but his name is the only thing that's left. So don't ruin his name by just kind of just mentioning that that the Waynes have long gone. So moving on. I don't know. We got all kinds of sorts of analysis or whatever on that one. So moving on. So we go on to here, and so Bruce ends up going and wanting to seek justice, and so we end up having it to where Bruce is forced to go to the proceedings of Joe Chill. Go to the proceedings, meaning going to a courtroom of Joe Chill, because we end up finding out that it seemed that Joe Chill had had some dirt under a guy named Falcone. It seems that ultimately Joe Chill had spent some time in the same prison as Falcone, and it seems that he had learned some information that he could shed light on to ultimately get him to be out of prison earlier than expected. So you ultimately end up having it to where Bruce and Rachel are to be intertwined with one another, with this moment to ultimately have it be that Rachel is trying to do what she thinks is right, but Bruce is ultimately saying it's like, God, like, how is it that this guy could kill my parents and seemingly get away with it? And Rachel is just like, well, he had information. It's like, so what? He still murdered people. There's this Bruce and Rachel kind of debate back and forth about like how information could still justify that this guy is still a murderer in the end. Like how Bruce is mentioning how to Rachel that their system is broken, that murderers are going free off the street, and we end up having it to where eventually that Rachel has to show him the darker side of life. Ultimately showing him to the Narrows. Or ultimately it's like, well, hey Bruce, like, how about you just kind of like look beyond your pain, look beyond your own pain, and see all the people struggling, all the people that are going to have to forcibly turn into a Joe Chill like every single day to be able to make it in this world, in this Gotham. And so we end up having it to where they go to the court. We end up having it to where Joe Chill ends up getting released because of all the information he had. We end up having it to where they justify that Joe Chill ultimately had done what he done out of desperation. Ultimately, Joe Chill comes up and says, like, well, what I did, there is no forgiveness for. And, like, it doesn't make up for what he had done, but, like, just having this information, I guess, is just going to help him kind of eventually, like, him coming clean for something is to ultimately, I guess, help him kind of feel rehabilitated for the rest of his life. So we end up having it to where Joe Chill gets released, and we end up finding out that Bruce Wayne had a gun in his pocket, waiting to go and kill Joe Chill if Joe Chill had gotten out free. So we end up having it to where Joe Chill ends up walking out of the court. We end up finding out that Falcone had sent a woman out to go and shoot down Joe Chill, ultimately saying that Falcone says hello. So we end up having it to where Joe Chill ends up getting shot, and so ultimately we end up finding out that Rachel is to come there to comfort Bruce yet again, and to say it's like, well, hey, like, to mention in comfort, and we ultimately end up finding out that Bruce ends up showing we end up having Rachel return to Bruce yet again, and we end up finding out that Bruce is really just kind of really angry about that he was not able to get his revenge, to be able to get his to finally be able to seek his vengeance. And so that will push him on the path of eventually going and seeking out Ra's al Ghul and his men eventually. Because ultimately we have it to where we find out that Bruce had a weak moment where he was pulling out the gun to show to Rachel, and Rachel slaps him in the face, and ultimately telling him that it's like, your parents would be disappointed in you. That you ultimately took out this gun and was going to kill this man. Like, your parents would have been disappointed. So, we end up having to where Bruce decides at this moment, after going and seeking out Falcone, to run away. Because we ultimately have to where Bruce ends up confronting Falcone, and Falcone ends up saying, like, hey, like, you didn't have to come here to thank me. And we end up having it to where Bruce ultimately is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, I just wanted to show you that, like, there's some people in this city that aren't afraid of you. And we end up having it to where Falcone ends up throwing back into Bruce's face. It's like, dude, you have to go to a million miles for anybody to know your name. And on top of that, it's like, you don't realize that there are people in your life that ultimately could be snuffed out because of you. Like your Alfred, your Rachel Dawes, any number of your friends could ultimately be snuffed out. And so ultimately, it's like, we end up having to where Falcone is basically like, hey, like, you're coming down here with your anger. Don't give me your anger. Like, like, if anything, like, we have to where Falcone had basically mentioned how bad the city is, to where there's so many government officials and stuff like that, and Bruce Wayne could take a gun and just shoot him in the head right then and there, and he wouldn't have a second thought about it. Ultimately telling how bad this city is and how Falcone has bought and paid everyone in this town. So we end up having to where Bruce runs away to ultimately go and start to slowly but surely become a thief. Start to slowly but surely, like, steal things to be able to just eat its simple food. But eventually we end up having to where Bruce never had really and truly become an actual thief, because what he ended up doing was he ended up robbing and stealing from himself. He ended up stealing all kinds of things that ultimately had said Wayne Enterprises on it. And so technically he wasn't stealing from himself. So we end up finding out that eventually Bruce Wayne is to end up in prison. To ultimately he is having nightmares. Ultimately to wake up and to ultimately have it to where seemingly there are men that are wanting to consistently go and fight him every single day. We ultimately have it to where there is a guy that is to come up to Bruce and ultimately say, hey, richer man, I am the devil. And we ultimately have it to where Bruce Wayne says, like, well, you're not the devil, you're practice. So we end up having to where Bruce Wayne ends up going and fighting supposedly 6 to 7 men. And we end up having to where the police guards ends up pulling him away, ultimately saying, like, that it's because of protection. And Bruce Wayne's like, well, like, I don't need protection. It's like, no, protection from them. It's like, that is such a goofy line. Whatever. So we end up having to where Bruce Wayne ends up going into, I guess, solitary confinement. We end up having to where Bruce Wayne ends up meeting Ducard, and we ultimately have it to where Ducard is ultimately having it to where it's like, hey, here's a deal for you. Come on down, and instead of going and fighting prisoners in jail one by one, how about you come to me and join the League of Shadows? So we end up having it to where Bruce Wayne ends up deciding to go to this environment, and he ends up having to go and pluck a flower and make his way to the League of Shadows. Ultimately, we have it to where Ducard ultimately is to meet Bruce, and so we end up having to where Bruce is supposedly exhausted, and we have it to where Ducard ultimately demands to have a fight with him. And so we end up having it to where Ducard and Bruce end up fighting it out, and consistently we end up finding out that there are several different fighting styles that seemingly Bruce has. Kanta, Tiger, Jiu-Jitsu, a bunch of things all compiled all into one, and hilariously enough, we end up having it to where, like, Ducard says, like, you're very skilled, but this is not a dance. And so we end up having it to where Ducard eventually just starts laying into Bruce Wayne and just starts beating the living crap out of him. And we end up having it to where Bruce Wayne is saying that he's tired, and we end up having it to where Ducard, it's like, well, too freaking bad. It's like evil won't go easy on you. Like, evil won't think anything is at all fair. Like, it's like vengeance won't, or evil will not wait to see you at your prime, your best, or whatever. Like, that's the thing that ultimately Batman eventually learns, is just like, no matter what, like, just keep going. Just keep going. So we push on. So we end up having it to where there are so many tests that has to take place to ultimately train Bruce to perfect everything. We eventually have it to where Bruce is to numerously train, do all these kind of acrobatic whatever studies and skills and whatever of such. We ultimately end up having it to where we find out that there is like smoke pellets and stuff that ultimately are to have illusions, so ultimately Bruce can ultimately skate away without being seen. As well as also like due diligence, where we ultimately have it to where there's some parts where ultimately you can kind of cling on to certain things by techniques and stuff along those lines. So pushing on even more. So we eventually have it to where we have the fight out between Ducard and Bruce, where ultimately they are talking about Bruce's family dying. And ultimately we have it to where Ducard is to mention to Bruce, it's like, well, hey, your parents' death is not your fault, it's your father's. And ultimately we have it to where Bruce is like, well, like, no, there's no way that it's my father. It's like Joe Chill had a gun kind of thing, and Ducard is like, well, would that have stopped you? And Bruce is like, well, I've had training. It's like, training means nothing. It's all about the will to act. And so ultimately, like, we have it to where within this fight of this fight that is around this icy waters, we end up having to where Bruce's anger is making him very much a clumsy fighter. To ultimately we end up having it to where Ducard, eventually with his veteran experience, ultimately is to mention, it's like, well, hey, like, you sacrificed sure footing for killing Stroke. Ultimately, you need to mind your surroundings. And eventually we have it to where Ducard ends up slapping a piece of ice, and Bruce Wayne ends up falling over into the ice. We end up having it to where Ducard mentions, hey, rub your chest. So ultimately, Bruce Wayne is to try to fight God, what is it? What's the word? I'm trying to think of it. He's trying to fight his body freezing, let's just say. Because I know full well that ultimately, when your body is up to severely cold temperatures, basically the thing that you have to keep warm is your chest. basically, eventually, when you reach too cold of temperatures, ultimately, your fingers and your toes will ultimately eventually start to fall off and start to eventually just start slowly but surely uh, losing their abilities to do any number of things. But if you keep your chest ultimately just warm and heated and whatever, that ultimately that's all that you'll need to be alive for. Or that's how you can keep yourself alive, is by basically keeping your chest as warm as humanly possible compared to the rest of your body. Um, so we ultimately have it to where Ducard ultimately mentions how he had a great love and a woman that which he had lost, which ultimately had uh, made him want to come here. We ultimately find out that it seemed that Ducard is eventually going to ask Bruce Wayne about like, why didn't you ever get vengeance for the parents that you had lost? And then eventually is when we get the whole court scene and stuff along those lines. Eventually we have it to where we find out Ducard mentions to Bruce, it's like, well, like in some ways, like, do you have like grief about your parents? And ultimately we have it to where Bruce ultimately says it's like, my anger outweighs my guilt kind of thing. And so we ultimately had this like really nice moment where like Ducard is ultimately mentioning about like the about his past, and Bruce Wayne is also mentioning about his past. So we end up having to where like Ducard can really like figure out like what is the best possible way to uh, work Bruce kind of in some ways. So what is the right buttons to push for Bruce? So we end up having it to where eventually that also so we end up having it to where Ducard has to do a test to ultimately showcase Bruce Wayne's greatest fear. And so, because we end up finding out that when, even when Bruce was ultimately being battered and beaten by Ducard for the first time, he ends up realizing that uh, Bruce fighting Ducard wasn't his fear. Ultimately, his fear was about bats. Bats terrified him. So, we end up having it to where ultimately Ducard uses this fear against Bruce to ultimately make it to where he has to work against this fear, and like this is his greatest test. So we end up having to where Ducard ends up going and hiding amongst guys that look exactly like him, all in some room. We end up having to where Bruce is to supposedly find Ducard within these group of guys, but also face his horrifying fear of bats. So we end up having to where Ducard and Bruce end up kind of fighting here and there, but then eventually it ends up we find out that Bruce ended up getting a cut on the arm. So we end up having to where Bruce ends up going and cutting a couple of guys upon their sleeve as matching as Bruce's. And so we eventually have it to where Ducard eventually finds one guy with the slice upon his arm, and so ultimately we end up having it to where Ducard is eventually supposed to give Bruce a morality story. Is like, never let anyone see a weakness, and then ultimately Bruce comes behind him and says like, I didn't. So we end up finding out that like Bruce has kind of passed every single possible test. So the very last test is to execute a man. Because we ultimately have it to where Ra's al Ghul is to tell Bruce what they are going to do. Because ultimately Bruce is Gotham's favorite son, and ultimately they are going to have him come into Gotham to allow it to die. As Gotham's favorite son, you go back there and allow Gotham to die. So we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce is supposed to kill a man, and Bruce will not allow it. He ultimately says it's like, well, give arrest this man, like give him a court system, and ultimately do it that way. I will not kill this man. We end up having to where Ducard is ultimately saying like, well, hey, like you need to kill this man. Like you have to do this. It's like there's no way back after this. So we end up having to where Bruce ends up going and almost going to attempt to kill the man, but eventually instead he ends up going and triggering some explosives to go upon the Ra's al Ghul home. So we eventually have it to where Bruce is to knock out Ducard and eventually go and attack Ra's al Ghul as well as his several ninja-like minions of sorts. So we eventually have it to where this place is starting to burn down. This place is ultimately we end up having to where this Ra's al Ghul is ultimately to be killed in this home, and so we eventually have it to where Bruce ends up collecting Ducard and trying to make his way out of this building. But eventually we end up finding out that they end up almost sliding completely off the building, but Bruce ends up kind of grabbing Ducard and grabbing a off to the side ledge, like piece of piece with his hand to ultimately keep them safe, so on and so forth. So we end up having it to where Ducard ends up going and we end up having to where Bruce ends up taking Ducard to a home where they end up taking care of him, and the man ultimately tells Bruce that it's like, well, hey, I'll tell Ducard that that you that you took care of him or whatever. So moving on. So we have it to where Bruce ends up deciding like, hey, I'm gonna call Alfred up and ultimately say, hey, buddy, give me my private jet, because I'm going back to Gotham. So ultimately, Alfred ends up uh, greeting with Bruce, ultimately basically telling him it's like, wow, you look dashing apart from the mud. So we end up having it to where Alfred is giving Bruce the 411, basically saying it's like, hey, you've been gone for 7 years, so we've declared you dead, because ultimately Wayne Enterprises wanted to sell all their shares. Boo frickety who for you, because ultimately you're basically still a millionaire, and ultimately, hey, if you want to borrow the Rolls Royce, you can, because ultimately you left every single thing to me, because you had been declared dead. So we end up having it to where Bruce is telling Alfred what he plans to do. That ultimately, as a man, he could be ignored or he can be corrupted, but as a symbol is everlasting. A symbol can't be ignored, and so on and so forth. And so ultimately, we end up having it to where we have now the build to Batman. So we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce is to come back to Wayne Enterprises to basically show his face again to say hey, I'm back. So we ultimately have it to where Earl is a man that was supposed to wait till Bruce became 18 to uh, have Bruce take over the Empire, which he never did. So we end up having it to where ultimately Earl is kind of taking over the Wayne Enterprise business without with Bruce not being there. So we eventually have it to where Bruce and Earl have this talk of basically Earl saying it's like, well, hey, we're I'm sorry that we kind of took all of your shares, but or we sold all of your shares or whatever, but sorry, you were dead. We had to move on. And so ultimately we end up having to where like ultimately Earl was talking about their business going public. It's like, hey, we have to do something. So we end up having it to where ultimately at the very tail end of this, we end up having it to where Bruce Wayne eventually buys every single bit of the stocks to get complete 100% control of this business, so on and so forth. So pushing on. So eventually we have it to where Earl is to try and to basically get rid of Bruce. And what better way to team him up with Lucius Fox in the science division? So we end up having it to where Bruce ends up talking to Lucius consistently about either spelunking, space jumping, cave diving, all these kinds of extreme sports that ultimately end up leading us into finding items that will put together the Batman arsenal, whether it's the Batman cape and cowl and costume, or ultimately it's the tumbler, which becomes the Batmobile, or any number of other things, like the memory cloth, which ultimately becomes the cape, so on and so forth. So we eventually have it uh, to where Bruce is to become the Batman slowly but surely, but eventually we have it to where seemingly uh, Bruce Wayne is to try to find out in the city who are the people that are the good people that will work with him to uh, be the people that are going to do the right thing. And we end up having to where Bruce ends up finding out that seemingly Jim Gordon is a good cop, and so ultimately we have it to where Bruce ends up going to Jim to ultimately find out how exactly Falcone can be put away for good. So Gordon gives Bruce that information, and so Bruce ends up kind of running out, and uh, Gordon ends up chasing after him, but eventually uh, Bruce ends up getting away, and Jim ends up just calling him some nut. So we end up pushing on. So eventually we end up finding out that like Jim and Flask, it seems that Flask is kind of the dirtier cop, ultimately to where Flask is ultimately telling Jim that's like, well, hey, like the thing of it is that since since Jim doesn't take any money from and be a dirty cop, that's what is getting every other kind of cop feeling like their feathers are ruffled, and they don't like it. They don't like that he's not like how every other cop is dirty but him. And to where ultimately Jim like kind of replies in kind. It's like, well, like when looking at it, it's like, well, at least I'm not going to rat to anybody, because who could I rat to in a town that's dirty? So moving on. So we end up having it to where eventually the Scarecrow gets to be introduced into this story. We end up having it to where Dr. Jonathan Crane eventually is to be kind of curving a lot of certain prisoners into, instead of jail time, to be in therapy or to be in a mental hospital instead. So we end up finding out that seemingly that uh, Scarecrow is ultimately to be seemingly adjusting of Rachel Dawes, because we end up finding out that Rachel Dawes is to be given photos that are ultimately going to uh, put people into bad lights and stuff along those lines in this town. Because we ultimately end up finding out that Batman gives Rachel some photos that are going to incriminate some people and kind of get the wheels turning, so to speak. So we end up having it to where eventually Batman is to go and take Falcone and implement him in a crime. Because ultimately we have it to where Batman ends up going out as full-on Batman and ultimately going and taking down every Falcone person. Because we end up finding out that that Rachel's Finch, Rachel's friend Finch, Finch, that ultimately works at the DA, ultimately had been found dead, and so ultimately Rachel is looking for him, and immediately she thinks that, oh, okay, well, I'll go and look in any place where a person would be found dead. So we end up having to where Batman or Bruce is forced into being Batman to otherwise seek justice for Finch. And so we eventually have it to where Batman eventually, one by one, takes care of all of Falcone's gang members and eventually ends up going and because they were supposedly dealing drugs over the Narrows. So we end up having to where Falcone eventually is to be subdued and put on a big fat light of sorts. So eventually they go to the Falcone crime and immediately they think, oh well, Falcone isn't actually part of this crime, but he's actually in the area. So they're going like, wow, like we got everything on Falcone, isn't that amazing? So eventually we have it to where Scarecrow ends up going and taking to Falcone, and because ultimately Falcone uh, mentions to Scarecrow how they were going to get rid of Rachel, but that doesn't quite work out, and so eventually we have it to where Falcone is otherwise threatening Scarecrow because he has so much information on him. Well, Scarecrow ends up making Falcone so insane that ultimately there is nothing that Falcone is going to mutter upon Crane's behalf. So we end up having to where Rachel ends up going and realizing that Falcone all of a sudden is now cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And so she ends up wanting to do some blood work because she is kind of confused how this guy is gone from uh, a tough man to all of a sudden tears in his eyes, talking about a scarecrow consistently, which makes no sense. So we end up having to where Rachel is to want to do some blood work, ultimately to kind of see what Crane had put him on. And so Crane ends up taking Rachel in an elevator to take her down to where ultimately they are siphoning all of this fear toxin into the water supply. So we eventually find out that Crow ends up giving Rachel a dose of fear toxin. And so eventually we have it to where ultimately Batman is to come for Rachel. So we end up having to where eventually that Batman is to subdue all of these characters and also give Crane a dose of his own medicine. And like I know there's a whole like moment even well before this where we end up having to where uh Batman takes Flask because ultimately Batman asked Jim Gordon about where exactly could I find the guy that ultimately is going to be tying into uh, Falcone and stuff like that, and we end up having to where well, Flask knows, Flask will know everything, and so reasonably we have it to where Flask needs to be squeezed for information, and Batman is the only one that could get that information of Flask. So eventually we have this whole moment where eventually Batman strings Flask upside down, ultimately telling him it's like, I'm not a cop. uh, ultimately talking about narrows and dealers and stuff like that. So eventually, Batman gets all the information from Flash, so he dumps him. So, anyway, so we end up pushing on further on into this movie. So we end up having to where Crane is now crazy, and so now we end up having to where ultimately, so we end up having and finding out that the fear toxin had been dipped into uh, this city for a fairly long time, but ultimately it needs to be released via an aerosol form to ultimately have a real effect. So eventually, we end up finding out that Wayne Enterprises had lost some device that ultimately goes and takes water and disperses it out as a like an inhaler of sorts or some kind of way of approaching it. So there's some bizarre device that ultimately takes water and doing it exactly the people are very concerned about it being that ultimately taking this drug, and it has to be much more of an inhaler kind of approach, uh, and so on and so forth. So we end up having to where Wayne Enterprises had lost a device specifically for this one thing and one thing alone, and we ultimately end up having to where Bruce ends up having to take Rachel as well as his bats that ultimately help him kind of get through all of these cops. So we end up having to where eventually Bruce is to try and rescue Rachel before her mind completely becomes lost. Eventually, we end up having it uh, to where Batman had been poisoned by Crane's toxin before. When ultimately we end up having it to where Bruce Wayne had tried to take down uh, some of the guys that were prepping some of the drugs, and eventually we end up having to where Crane ends up meeting with Bruce and hitting him with the thing of fear toxin, and so we end up having to where Bruce ends up going and having to get inoculated because it was a weaponized hallucinogen. So Bruce ends up helping, or Lucius ends up helping and saving Bruce. So we end up having it to where we end up having it to where now Bruce has to save Rachel from the exact same thing. It seems like she had gotten a concentrated dose, and so ultimately her mind won't last very long. We end up having it to where Bruce ends up driving on rooftop with the Batmobile to make it back to Wayne Manor, or the Batcave, really. So we end up having it to a reasonably that Bruce, of course, makes it all the way through here, Tumblr and all. And so eventually we have it to where there is a birthday party that is going on. And so ultimately we have it to where Bruce is to go and uh, is to inoculate Rachel and then eventually go off to be a part of this party. And so we end up having to where Alfred is telling, uh, or Bruce is telling Alfred to get rid of Rachel. Of course, Alfred does. So we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce is to go to this party, and eventually we end up having to where we find out that there is a person there that is going to have Bruce greet Ra's al Ghul. And we ultimately have it to where Bruce mentions to this Ra's al Ghul, it's like, well, hey, like, you're not Ra's al Ghul. I had seen Ra's al Ghul die. And we ultimately have it to where Ducard comes out of nowhere and ultimately says, like, well, maybe Ra's al Ghul isn't actually the Ra's al Ghul that you thought. Uh, maybe his methods are supernatural. Maybe there's something more than you think that Ra's al Ghul is. Or ultimately, we have it to where Bruce mentions is like, well, yeah, like cheap parlor tricks to like seal your identity, Raz. So we end up finding out that Ducard, Liam Neeson's character, ultimately was Ra's al Ghul the entire time. And so we're like, oh, so he's the real bad villain. So we end up having it to where ultimately Liam Neeson is to ultimately tell him it's like, hey, like everybody in this manor is going to die unless you do something. So we end up having to where Bruce is like saying it's like, well, hey, take me. You don't have to take any number of these other people. And we end up having to where Liam or Descartes ultimately says it's like, well, like Raz ultimately says like, well, like you can tell them that. So we end up having to where Bruce ultimately pretends that he's drunk to ultimately tell the people the most insulting things to get them to leave, to get them to get out of his party. And so you ultimately have it to where Descartes it's like says Descartes ultimately says it's like, well, that's all good and well and all, but it makes no difference. Like it's either that these people die here or they die somewhere in Gotham. It's going to happen. We ultimately have it to where ultimately Liam talks about the whole transitional way of them trying to have let Gotham die. Ultimately, this time they had chose economics, but it seems that uh, people like Thomas Wayne and Martha Wayne had kept Gotham from dying. Um, and so ultimately, we end up having to where I guess like the Waynes were the true people to keep this city alive, and ultimately we have it to where Bruce is trying to keep this town alive as well. So we end up having it to where they try to burn down the Wayne Manor, and ultimately that ends up happening. So we end up having to where Liam ultimately or Descartes ultimately goes and uh, like the house is burning all around him, and we end up having it to where Bruce ends up getting into a fight, which ultimately lends a seemingly big fat piece of Wayne Manor on top of Bruce, and we ultimately end up having it to where Descartes ultimately mentions like, well, you left me and my house for dead, so ultimately I did consider us even. Because when really looking at it, Descartes ultimately had been saved, but Descartes was not Descartes. Descartes was Ra's al Ghul, and Ra's al Ghul was left for dead. And so when looking at it, like if Ra's al Ghul was actually Ra's al Ghul, like he would have actually been dead in that home. But considering Ra's al Ghul was Descartes, so it's a whole thing. So we end up having to where eventually Ducard and them all leave to go and put this device into a subway, which ultimately is going to have all the manhole covers pop off because the water is going to shoot out of all of these subways or all these sewer systems to turn into uh, this poison, this fear toxin that is going to be spreading all over the world or spreading all over Gotham. So we ultimately have it to where Crane thought that uh, they were going to take the fear toxin and hold people for ransom because ultimately Crane is not a real League of Shadows member, so on and so forth. So eventually we have it to where, so moving on. So Batman is ultimately to be rescued by Alfred, where we end up having to where Alfred is to wake up Bruce from seemingly a burning house, and ultimately we have it to where Alfred is trying to help him, but ultimately he ends up giving him some crap. It's like, dude, like, you do all those push-ups and you can't lift a bloody log. So Bruce ends up lifting the bloody log. So we move on to have Batman having to spring into action to ultimately go and to try to save random people within this town. But it's all to lead to ultimately have Gordon, uh, one, try to get inoculated, and two, to ultimately have him drive stick, which ultimately means him to drive the tumbler to go and try and bypass to get it to where ultimately Gordon will save the town by ultimately having a piece of the monorail or whatever to be destroyed. Easy enough. So we end up having to where Batman ends up going and wanting to fight out Ra's al Ghul. And ultimately we end up having to where seemingly Raz at first brings out some minions to where ultimately eventually Bruce takes down. So eventually we have it to where both Ra's al Ghul and the device ends up going uh, into the train to where eventually they are kind of popping themselves off through portions of this place. Eventually, we have it to where Rachel Dawes is ultimately with some kid, and they are to try to evade all of these people that are going to be fear toxined. We eventually have Flash, who ultimately ends up almost shooting two kids because he thinks that they're monsters, and vice versa. So, Commissioner Gordon ends up knocking out Flash, and eventually, we eventually have it to where Batman ends up going and saving Rachel from eventually being killed. So, because eventually we have it to where Scarecrow ends up riding around on a horse, and we end up having it to where Rachel ends up taking a taser to Scarecrow to end up taking and incapacitating him. We eventually have it to where Bruce Wayne, as Rachel and his kid were ending up getting cornered, Batman ends up going and grabbing both of them and putting them on some rooftop to make them safe. So we end up having to where Bruce Wayne ends up going and jumping off, or going to try to jump off the roof to try and save everybody. And we have it to where Rachel ultimately says in response is like, "Hey, like, you could die. At least tell me your name." And we end up having it to where ultimately Bruce says it's like, well, it's not who I am, but what I do that defines me. Because we end up having, of course, this moment where we end up finding out that, like, when Bruce comes back, he ends up buying hotels that are way too lavishly expensive just because he can. We ultimately have it to where Rachel is ultimately ending up having to go and find uh, her co-worker at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. So we end up having to where Bruce is ultimately saying it's like, well, like, this, me being this, it's not really me. I am more. And we ultimately have it to where Rachel hits him with, it's like, well, it's not who you are underneath, but what you do, and so on and so forth. So we end up having to where Bruce Wayne, or to where Batman reconfirms to Rachel that he is Bruce. And so eventually we have it to where Rachel is just like, yeah, like, the guy that ultimately, like, I gave up on, like, he has reconfirmed to me that he is going and trying to be like the good guy. Like, he is, like, so on and so forth. So we have it to where Batman ultimately goes out and tries to get to the subway, and eventually goes into Gatling gun thing and ends up going onto the train. Ultimately ends up fighting it out with Ra's al Ghul, but of course it ends up, of course, being to where to where Batman ultimately has to show to Ra's al Ghul that it's like, well, hey, like you're gonna run out of track, because ultimately we have it to where Gordon ends up firing uh, the Batmobile to where ultimately it crashes the pieces that will connect this train to the place where ultimately every single sewer system is going to blow. So we end up having to where Ra's al Ghul realizes that he is defeated. We ultimately have it to where Batman ultimately is to kind of have his batarang, or his whatever, to go and almost try and kill Ra's al Ghul, but and so ends up Ra's al Ghul is like, well, you're finally going to kill me. You're finally going to do what's right. And we end up having to where Bruce Wayne says, like, I'm not going to kill you, but I'm not going to save you either. So we end up having to where Batman ends up kind of leaving himself from the train and flying off. And we end up having to where Ra's al Ghul ends up crashing with the train to basically die. So we end up finding out that, like, and there's a lot of moments that I try to really severely rush through this movie to get it reviewed, because it would take so much time to go through all of this stuff. Like, there's probably going to be a lot of scenes that I'm going to regret not talking about, but there's also, because I could have talked about the any number of Batcave scenes that ultimately were really cool, and ultimately talking about the one scene where uh, Alfred and Bruce share in the elevator, about the Wayne Manor burning, and ultimately it's just like, well, hey, it's just bricks and borders, and ultimately have it to where Bruce ultimately says, like, I failed Gotham, and it's like, well, why do we fall? To get back up. So we end up having it to where all of this eventually gets to be resolved, and basically to say, like, Crane and all the other inmates are safe back in Gotham, and because all the prisoners had escaped, everybody had been ultimately rearrested, and so eventually we have it to where Bruce is just kind of looking around at his home that is now completely burnt down. We end up having Rachel Dawes coming back to Bruce to ultimately talk about, like, hey, you saved Gotham, good for you, like, your parents will be proud. So because we end up having to her, hilariously enough, we end up having uh to her Bruce ends up giving Rachel as a gift the Finders Keepers thing, the arrow. And so we end up having it to her ultimately. Rachel at the end of this is to tell Bruce that his parents would be proud of him of what he's done, and eventually we have it to where Rachel and Bruce kiss, and the thing of it is just the fact that, like, she loves him, but, like, she can't be with a man that, or the person that she wants to be with is a person that cannot be seen, because we have it to where ultimately Rachel mentions that Bruce Wayne is a mask to the to Bruce. The Bruce Wayne is ultimately not the real Bruce Wayne. The man that she loved, the man that vanished, never really came back. Because Bruce Wayne is a facade. And ultimately Batman to her is the man is the man that she wanted, and now she cannot get. And so ultimately, she is telling him when the world no longer needs Batman, that maybe she will see him again, that she will love him again, and like that is the interesting part of this. We end up finding out that supposedly Bruce is going to rebuild the entire Wayne Mansion, and we end up having it to where eventually the real last thing is to eventually have it to where eventually Batman is to go and see Commissioner Gordon, because we end up finding out that Commissioner Gordon has put out the bat signal. And so we end up having it to where Commissioner Gordon is thanking Batman, or trying to thank Batman, but ultimately Batman says, like, well, like, you'll never have to. So because we end up having to where Commissioner Gordon is saying, like, you really started something, if anything, like thank you for saving our city and all kinds of things, and like Bruce is like, you're never gonna have to thank me. So we end up having to where, of course, Batman ends up flying off, and that's how like we resolve this whole movie, and that's how I can resolve this whole review. I apologize for how long this review took. There's so much crap to go through in this movie. There's a lot of stuff to dissect. There's a lot of interesting things going on. And ultimately, like, this is going to be, like, a really hard review to pull back from, because when really looking at it, I think I'm going to miss so much crap that ultimately I'm just so concerned. I'm like, yeah, I didn't say this and I didn't say that. And then I'm going to feel so bad about it. And ultimately I'm going to just be saying, like, man, if I only would have had 30 more minutes to ultimately say more things. But anyways, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie, I hope. But if anything, at the end of the day, I could do this movie again, review it again at the end of the day. Just be like, yeah, I forgot about this, or I did this, or I didn't do this, or I forgot about blah, blah, blah. But anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.